Hi, so my name is Oksana Bihun, and this video is the first video in a series dedicated to surviving psychological trauma. And so I just wanted to explain what is the motivation for this series and why on earth I would want to do something like that. So my intention is to share some helpful strategies to cope and heal from trauma. So I just want to make a disclaimer. I am not a psychologist and I have not been trained to provide psychological counseling, and this series is by no means a replacement for diagnosis or treatment of any kind of trauma or any kind of medical or mental health illness or any kind of condition. The reason why I want to share something like that is that from my own personal experience, it seems like coping and healing from trauma is usually a long process, and sometimes getting help from health providers who are trained to provide that help may not be enough. In the sense that one wants to connect with other people who have survived it. And so I myself have looked for videos on trauma on YouTube, and there are a lot of videos. What I would like to do in this series is to focus not so much about describing trauma and why it happens and what kind of trauma there is, but to focus more on how to cope with trauma and how to heal. And so as a fellow trauma survivor, I want to share with other people who have survived and are surviving or are dealing with trauma what helps me. And by doing so, I'll be helping myself and hopefully also helping other people. And the idea is to focus on some positive coping strategies and to kind of create maybe even a community of people who would know that they're not alone. So the journey of trauma, it can be lonely, and I just want to share one piece of research that I came across that was helpful in dealing with that. So there is a book that is called Shattered Illusions, and in this book the authors describe that usually prior to surviving any kind of trauma, we tend to have these assumptions about the world, what the world is like, and what we should expect from the world. And oftentimes, even though those assumptions might be incorrect, but it is something that we would like to believe to feel safe. So one of those beliefs is that the world is benevolent and that people who do good things, people who do the right things, usually get good outcomes. And so that necessarily immediately implies that if I have experienced a negative outcome, I must have surely done something wrong. And so in this book, this is described as a basic belief. And so we know, if we really sit down and think about it, we know that bad things may happen to anybody at any time, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they've done something wrong. So it can be a natural disaster, it can be a car accident, it can be any number of things. It can be a financial crisis that one did not contribute to, and yet we sort of tend to believe that somehow if we do the right things, we'll get good outcomes. And so this belief is related to the desire of at least feeling like we have control over our lives. Because if we admit that some bad things can happen anytime, it's kind of a struggle, because then we have to deal with this fact that we do not always have control over what happens to us, and that can be scary. And so we may prefer, if nothing bad happens to us, we may prefer to think that our good life is a consequence of our good choices, good decisions, or hard work. And so there is nothing wrong with, per se, with having these beliefs, but the way it contributes into isolating people who have trauma is the following. People who do not experience the same trauma, when they meet somebody who has experienced something that they didn't predict, something horrible like a car accident, or I don't know, loss of a parent, any number of things. So if I meet a person who has been in a car accident, and maybe twice in 1 year, I may be inclined to think that maybe this person was not driving carefully, because how come they have been in a car accident twice in 1 year? And yet, for this person, this may be a very traumatic experience, and they did nothing wrong. They drove carefully both times and all the time, and they were just hit twice in 1 year. And so why wouldn't I want to come on their side and admit that they did nothing wrong? Because if I do that, it means that if I am a good driver and I continue to drive well, it may still happen to me that I may have a car accident in the future, and maybe a lot of car accidents within a short period of time. And that's something that I may not want to deal with at the time, and it's something that might be sort of unconscious for me. And so in my behavior with this person who has been traumatized, who is coping with trauma, not even realizing that I have done something like that, I may behave in such a way that I may keep asking them, like, what did you do wrong? Or I may not even ask them a question, but they will feel that I have assumed that they must have done something wrong to get involved into these car accidents. So this is just an example of how this desire to have a sense of control over our lives, it sort of alienates people who have not experienced trauma from people who have experienced trauma. And this doesn't necessarily happen in a conscious way, but this is just something that I have discovered through reading this book, Shattered Illusions. And so indeed, after experiencing trauma, our illusions, they do get shattered, because we realize that some really bad things may happen to us, while somebody next door who has behaved in exactly the same way may not experience the horrible negative consequences and events that we have been through. And so I just want to tie this idea to the necessity or the motivation for this YouTube channel, why it is important for people who did experience trauma and who are healing from it to connect with each other, because we have all experienced shattering of some basic assumptions and beliefs, which, as erroneous as they might be, used to make us feel safer in the world. And now we live in this with a different system of beliefs, where the world is not as safe as we thought it was, and yet we operate around people who perceive the world somewhat differently from compared to us, because they haven't had the same experiences. And so I think that this basically lays a background for future videos for this channel. And one positive thing that I want to share with you today, and that I also commit to doing, just like an exercise. So I'm going to ponder on my traumatic experiences, and I'm going to try to accept that they have happened, and that it doesn't necessarily mean that I have caused these experiences. And I invite you to look back at whatever traumatic experience you have had in your life and whatever trauma you're coping with, to look back on that and just try to accept and forgive yourself for having had that experience. If you've been in a car accident, no matter whose fault it was, can you forgive yourself for having had a car accident? If you have been abused as a child, can you forgive yourself for having been abused? If you have experienced poverty for whatever reason, can you forgive yourself for not having enough means to buy the things that you needed? If you have been traumatized by a political system that undermined your freedom, can you forgive yourself for having lived in a country, or for living in a country in this present time that provides you with these traumatizing experiences? If you have lost social support because you immigrated, or maybe because you just moved to a different state, can you forgive yourself for being far away from your friends? If you are struggling with the pandemic right now, can you forgive yourself for being isolated in your house and not being able to talk to anybody? If you have been part of an accident, or witnessed an accident, or have witnessed death and violence, or a natural disaster, can you forgive yourself for being a part of it or witnessing it? If you have been exposed to an unhealthy environment, for example, a high crime neighborhood or an abusive work environment, can you forgive yourself for having had that experience? If you've been a victim of domestic abuse, or have been traumatized by a relationship with a narcissist or a sociopath, can you forgive yourself for having been abused? And so I am going to work on this acceptance and forgiveness, first of all toward myself, with the traumatic experiences I've had. And I'm just curious how that works for you. If you care to comment, have you been able to forgive yourself? Was it easy? Was it difficult? Did you have inner struggle? Did you also have an urge to take responsibility for some of the things that happened to you over which you didn't have control? And was it confusing with taking responsibility for the things that you did have control over but didn't know how to handle, from the things of which you did have control and did know how to handle but still didn't handle well? And have you been able to let go of the guilt and the grief and forgive yourself? Thank you, and talk to you again.